PCS, BMV, critical care, long-term care, senior analyst over in our service division. And today we're going to be talking about post-live editing guidelines. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. For any of you who were with us yesterday when we went over assessment building, we talked a little bit about post-live editing guidelines and what that means within the various dictionaries. But today we're going to go into detail about post-live editing guidelines. And the information I'm covering is specific, is, for 6.0 and 6.1. So it applies to 6.07, 6.08, and our 6.1 platforms for PCS, and you can also kind of use this logic for EDM as well. All right, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature. We do have someone, Abby is with us again today, and she is monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, and Abby will let me know if we have a question, and we'll go from there. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are our post-live editing guidelines. We're going to go through examples within the group response dictionary, our query dictionary, the query group dictionary, instance type, documentation section, and intervention. And then I'm going to show you how you can get to our post-live editing guidelines because they are posted. Okay, so there are reports that we can use as well. So it's always helpful to use these reports within the dictionary. So if you want to know which group response exists on specific queries, if you go into the group response dictionary, so clinical, dictionaries, documents, group response, and then report. So let me minimize that so I can show you this report. I'm just jumping into our training ring. So clinical, dictionaries, documents, group response. And over here on the button on the side, reports. So I'm actually just going to use vs.temps and do detail. And I just want to see queries. And this is going to show me which queries this group response is on. So this one only happens to be on our temperature source query, but it is helpful if you're making edits to any group responses so you know which queries it's going to impact. So we also have a similar report within the query dictionary. So this in there can show us what query groups a query is on and which documentation section the queries are on. So I'm going to get out of full screen mode here and show you that in the query dictionary. So we go into the query dictionary and we access our report side button. Let's see, GA, that was one we were looking at yesterday. Let me use that one. And then down here we have documentation section and query groups. So I'm going to do it. So let's throw a couple more queries on here. And we're going to do all, just so I don't have to run it twice to show you the query groups and the documentation section. So I'm going to have to scroll down a little bit. So it looks like that first one isn't actually on anything. So our abdomen description, so I can see the documentation sections. So these are all the documentation sections that the query exists on. And same thing with the bs.temp. Here are all the documentation sections that that query is on. Let me find a query that's in a query group, just so you guys can see what that looks like. And query group. So down here, query groups, so it shows me the query groups that the specific query is on. So that's definitely helpful when you're looking to make any changes so you know where the queries are. Also within the documentation section dictionary, there you can run a report to alert you which which interventions that documentation section exists on. So I'm going to look for my vital signs, and I want to look at that, my vital signs assessment detail, and then if I do associations, that's going to show me all of the interventions. So these are all the interventions that have the vital signs assessment, and then down here, this is the only intervention that the sepsis assessment exists on. Okay. So next, I wanted to talk about our group response dictionary. So there are changes that you can make in the group response dictionary that won't have a negative impact, but there are also some that could have a negative impact. So your element name or your element long name, if you edit that in the group response dictionary, the edit is going to impact all past documentation. So we recommend that if you need to make a change to the element name or the element long name, that you only do that to correct or clarify that entry. You shouldn't change it to something completely different because what that's going to do is that's going to change all previous documentation. So our recommendation, and this is my recommendation, when in doubt, create new. So otherwise, you should make a new group response and a new query for that new group response. And then you'd want to add that to the documentation assessment and making the old query inactive on the documentation section. And also, if you do create a new query, always make sure that you go and add that query to your display assessments. So if there is a clinical panel that has that query on an assessment, you want to make sure that you see that query going forward. You wouldn't want to make the old query inactive on your display assessment just because you wanted to still be able to see it for past documentation. Other things to keep in mind, if an element name is removed, that response will not show for current documentation, and previous responses will not be able to be recalled. But past documentation will continue to display on the flow sheet and in the EMR and is allowed to be edited. Sorry, I had to blow my nose, so I put everyone on mute. Removing the element from the group response dictionary completely, which is attached to a query group, that actually does have negative responses, so that's something we would not recommend you doing. And adding a new element name will only show from that day forward. So adding an element in the group response dictionary which is attached to a query group in the query group dictionary will have negative responses though. So it's that's why it's important to see where things are attached in relation to query groups and queries. Other things to keep in mind with the group response dictionary, if the element rank is changed, the order in questionnaire mode and flow sheet mode will change. And also resorting the elements within the group response when it's associated to a query group will have negative consequences. So wouldn't necessarily recommend proceeding with that. Changing the element value, it's not going to impact any past documentation for a score or calculation, but if you are changing a value, keep in mind that for future scores and calculations, it might end up being different. Also, within the group response dictionary, you do have that active yes/no field. So in activating a group response on an active query, so the system is not going to be not going to allow a group response to be inactivated if it's still associated to an active query. So if you go to inactivate the group response, and it will pop up this warning message that we see here, and it will provide you a list of queries with that group responses associated to. So then you can then go and review that query to see if this is something that needs to be reviewed at a larger scale. Inactivating a group response on an inactive query. So if the query is not active on any documenting assessments, the system will no longer display the group responses on the work list. So you can see this is what ends up happening. So if I change it to no and the query is on an active documentation section, we end up seeing just a radio button with no information. So that's why it's important to also make sure that you make the query inactive on the documentation section.
Deb, we do have a question.
Okay.
Were you once able to add or delete a group response element without a negative consequence? My colleague said that they had tested this and they were able to do it in the past.
There's no negative consequence in reference to queries, but there's negative consequences in relation to query groups. So if that group response is associated to a query group, there will be negative consequences, but not necessarily with a group response in a query. Okay. So if I go and make my group response inactive after documentation has been done, in edit mode, only the previous selected answer will display. So only clear displays as opposed to every other option that was in there. If the previous document answer is then in edited mode, selected in edit mode, the answer disappears and is no longer available. So just if you're going to inactivate a group response, make sure that that's something you truly need to do. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the query dictionary and the impact that making changes to the query dictionary will have on your system. The query dictionary, when you do make changes, does let you know, like, just review this. So we always recommend reviewing our full post-live editing guidelines, which I'll show you how to get to. And also, before you make any of those changes in live, test them out and test to make sure everything you're seeing meets your needs. Okay, so when you're in the query dictionary, if you make an edit to the query text, the long text, or the descriptor text, that edit is going to be shown for all past documentation. So we recommend only using this to correct or clarify an entry, not changing the title or the context of it completely. Otherwise, make a new query and add it to the documentation assessment that you need, and then you can make sure that the old query is made inactive on the documentation section. As I mentioned when we were talking about the group response, making sure that you add your new query to any display assessments or clinical panels and keeping any of those old queries active. It's also important to keep in mind that the override label in the documentation section dictionary will override the query text and the long name. So if you need to maybe change something to the long text, you don't necessarily need to do it in the query dictionary. You could override it using the documentation section. The display name in the clinical panel only affects the display on the clinical panel. So you can override the name using that. Okay. So making an edit to the edit account query field. So blank to yes or yes to blank. So if this really is going to, for the most part, impact CDSs and PCS a little bit. So if initially the data gets entered using a CDS, the data will appear in PCS regardless of how the prompt is set. So the edit, the account query field, just make sure that the documentation, is shared between applications. So if the data is originally entered in PCS, the data will end up showing on CDS if it is set to yes. If it is set to no, it's not going to flow to the CDS. If the prompt is set to yes and the documentation is done in PCS, it's going to flow to the CDS, as I just mentioned. If the field is changed to no after the fact, the initial data will continue to display on the CDS, but new documentation in PCS will not flow to the CDS. Furthermore, if the prompt is blank and the initial documentation is then done in PCS, it's not going to show on the CDS. But if you then change it to yes, the initial PCS documentation will not flow, only new documentation will. So within the query dictionary, when you need to make something inactive, so if the query is inactivated in the query dictionary, it continues to be available for documentation. So this is why we have the active field on the documentation section. So if the query or sets of queries are no longer needed, you should make sure to always set it to active no on the documentation section. Some of the things that have negative consequences is replacing a group response. So here, if you change the group response that is associated to a query, the original documented answer will no longer display. You will not be able to recall, and it will not be available in edit mode. So if you need to change the group response, you do need to create a new query because this does have negative consequences. So here's an example of that. So the color was documented as clear, and then we went and changed the group response to something different. So it was replaced with a new group response. And you can see now, even though the answers were the same, the original answer does not display on the work list in questionnaire mode. It's not able to be recalled or in edit mode, but it will display on the EMR and patient reports. Some of the other things that can have negative consequences is changing the type of the query. So for the most part, this is locked down a little bit better now within the query dictionary, but at some points you are able to change the type. So if I change something to the group, from group to number, I'm going to see corruption like we're seeing here. Changing it back does address the corruption, but the number does end up still displaying. Changing a number to a weight, length, or temperature, past documentation is not going to recall, and it's not going to be available in edit mode, and it's actually not going to display in the EMR or patient reports. So if you need to change the type, I would fully recommend creating a new query. So if I need to change it from temperature to quantity, we are going to get corruption. You'll see right here, it kind of gets all mutilated and bunched together. So once again, create a new query. Changing something from comment to date. So when recalling the date after putting it into the comment, it's actually going to end up recalling in its internal format, and which ends up being year, month, day. And then quantity to from number. So if the length or decimal precision gets edited, the old value still remains intact. And in edit mode, the entry is going to respect the current defined length and decimal precision. Changing it from optional to group, you're no longer going to be able to see anything that was documented in the free text, and you're not going to be able to recall, and it's not in edit mode. And then date to result, when changing to a result, it's going to switch and display in the internal format as opposed to the documented format, as we can see down here. So long story short, with the type and queries, don't change the type of your queries. Create new if you do need a different type of query. Okay, query groups. So this is still somewhat new for PCS. We're just starting to be able to use query groups now. So we want to make sure that we highlight this. So when we're in the query group dictionary, whether it's a group response type or a yes/no type, changing the name, this is going to display for all current and previous documentation. So you'd only want to do something to clarify here because it is impacting previous documentation. Changing the column header, once again, all current and previous documentation. editing your response code exclusions. This does not negatively impact your previous documentation, so you should be fine there. And then changing the order of your queries does not negatively impact previous documentation. There are some negative impacts within the query group dictionary. So if you need to remove or replace a group response, all previous documentation will not display. So you should create a new query group if you need to do that. Resorting your group responses in the query group. This is going to negatively impact your current documentation in edit mode, the patient care panel, and patient reports. So these are the same negative consequences that were mentioned if you're re-ranking the group response dictionary, and it's not as in the query group. If you remove a query from the query group dictionary, all previous documentation will no longer display. So you would not want to go ahead and do that. And then deselecting the include box for a query on the application tab, all previous documentation will no longer display. So you'd want to create new if you needed to make a change like that. Next, we want to talk about the instance type dictionary and the changes that could impact you with changes you make to the instance type. So resorting any of your group responses in the instance type dictionary, this actually is going to end up, you're going to lose the trending of previous documented instances. So when you're looking in your clinical panels, how you're trending with your instances, you're going to end up losing that. So you wouldn't want to resort the group responses over here. Also, based on the order of the group responses on the instance type, so you can see here how it looks, and it's going to show in the work list and the EMR. If you change it within the instance type here, you can see what ends up happening is I lose that trending as I mentioned. So I have bases right here, and I have right bases here. Because even though these are the same things, the system doesn't see them as separate things. So if we go back to this one, we can see how my left-right is on top here. But if over here we moved it to the bottom, and that's what's causing us to lose our trending. So also within our instance type dictionary, past documentation of instances will remain intact if the edits are made in the instance type. However, trending does get impacted, so we wouldn't want to really resort those. Next one is our documentation section dictionary, and this is really the big one. So we're going to be talking about the main tab and our question sets tab, and when our status is set to final and what all of that means. So removing an instance type from a documentation section that previously had documentation under an instance, it's no longer going to display under an instance, and it cannot be edited. So if we go on to our next screenshot, so we see here we have that right bases and left bases down here, and it shows with the information. The instance type later gets removed, and if you look on the work list, I don't see that documentation anymore. I'm not able to recall, no longer displays in the patient care panel, only my label is going to display. It is going to continue to display on my clinical panels and my patient reports, but I'm not going to see it in the patient care panel. Also in edit mode, the instances and query data no longer display and then cannot be edited. Another thing that has changed over time is the ability to inactivate an assessment in the documentation section dictionary that is on an active intervention. So prior to 6.14 PP20, if it was made inactive, it would be suppressed from the work list in questionnaire mode, and it will show, and it'll show in gray when documenting, but you will still be able to edit. Prior to that change, the inactive assessment was grayed on the work list, and you weren't able to document it for any of the patients within the existing intervention. So here's an example of that. We have the documentation section is set to inactive, and this is still on in an active intervention. So here is the patient that has the active intervention. So the inactive assessment is going to display on patients with the existing intervention, but it's not going to be able to be documented. And if the assessment is inactive, in edit mode, you are able to edit it, and those edits will actually display and will display on our reports. Mm-hmm. Some other things to keep in mind that are very important for your documentation assessments. So if you need to add an instance, remove an instance, or replace an instance, you should create a new assessment and a new intervention. If you need to make any edits to your descriptor text in your documentation section dictionary, it is going to impact all past documentation. So this is another place where we would only recommend that you only correct or clarify. If you need to make changes to an override label, this will also impact any past documentation. So once again, you would only want to correct or clarify here. If you need to remove the override label, confirm that your query text or your long text has that same meaning of the override label, because then it will, removing the override label will impact all of your past documentation. So, and inactivating a documentation assessment that is on an active intervention is going to show as grayed out and not available for documentation. So also with this, we do have our display assessments. So all queries on display assessments should always all remain active, and you should always be sure to be adding any new queries. Any edit to the override label is going to display in your clinical panels, your vital signs panel, your I&O panel, along with your history panel within that patient care panel. So you'd only want to correct or clarify. Once again, removing that override label, making sure that the query text or long text has that same meaning. And also on display assessments, you want to make sure that there are no instances, no rules, or no jump rules. They won't do anything there. I've seen if you do have an instance on those, it causes corruption of the display assessment. So you want to make sure that none of those are there. And you would never want to use a display assessment as a documenting assessment. They should be two separate things. Okay. Next is the intervention dictionary. So this intervention dictionary has this assessment attached on the documenting tab. And by deleting or replacing a documentation section from an active intervention, the data is no longer going to display on the work list or when I'm in edit mode, and I cannot make any edits. The previous data will continue to display in the patient care panel and the clinical panel, as well as on your patient reports, but like I mentioned, you're not going to be able to make edits to it. So if it's something you do see yourself making edits to in the future, maybe creating a new intervention would be appropriate in this case. So after documentation, if it is then deleted from the intervention and replaced with a separate one, the work list is no longer going to display the documentation from the previous documentation that was done. And you can't edit it, so I cannot also recall it even if the same queries are used. But it does continue to show on EMR and patient reports. So it is there for historical reasons. But once again, like I mentioned, you're not able to edit. So got a little ahead of myself. So never delete a documentation section from an active intervention because you're not able to make any of those edits or see it on the work list. All right. So are there any questions about anything I went over before I go and show you how to get to our post-live editing guidelines?
There aren't any questions in the chat right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So if we go to the Meditech website, and I'm going to go to customers, and then I'm going to scroll down to product resources, and I'm going to click on 6.x. And then from patient care management, I'm going to go to patient care system. And then over under the training materials section, we have our post-live editing guidelines. So this is going to open up. So we have our assessment-related post-live ending guidelines, which I just went over. We have a 607 document, a 613 document that's a bit older, and our 614 document that's on here as well. The 614 document can be used for 615 and 616, as well as the 607 one does apply to 608. Down here, we also have our post-live ending guidelines as it refers to in-patient reports. So if you're looking to make any changes to patient reports, I would also recommend reviewing those. Does anyone have any questions about post-live ending guidelines?
I don't see any in the chat right now.
Okay, well, that is all I have for everyone today. If you do have any questions that come up, as always, please feel free to reach out to myself or your PCS specialist, as they will be able to help you with any of your post-live editing guidelines questions. All right, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.